You are watching a CBMF production.
I can do this all day.
I'm Batman.
You've got me! Who's got you?
Ladies and gentlemen, two-time Academy Award winner, Mahershala Ali.
Hey, Hugh, you want to play Wolverine one more time?
Yeah, sure, Ryan.
Black Panther himself, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chadwick Boseman.
Superheroes. What an interesting concept. I assume you understand the concept of what a superhero is, and you probably have a general liking to them in some way, shape, or form if you decide to click on this video. Whether that be from reading endless comics featuring your favorite Cape Crusaders, watching them in various forms of multimedia, cosplaying as some of your favorite characters, or a multitude of other ways to show your fandom, superheroes become a major piece of the cultural zeitgeist of our modern society. Now, the concept of heroes that people adore and aspire to be more of have been around since literary works were a thing, from the Adventures of Zorro, the Lone Ranger, no, not that one, and other heroes like it. Heroes have always been popular, at least from a Western culture standpoint, due to the fact that most people love to get lost in the adventures and stories of heroes that do fantastical things beyond their wildest dreams. And the concept of people, sometimes ordinary, sometimes not, gaining the access to an insane power set and using it to do good against the forces of evil is a recipe for success when you want to tell an entertaining and exciting story at the very least. And one of the companies that became a major player in making superheroes such a mainstream theme over the course of the past near century is of course the comic book publication Detective Comics, but to many people it is known as DC Comics. One of the two biggest juggernauts when it comes to superhero media ever since it was founded in 1937. It is home to some of the biggest characters and names in the cultural zeitgeist, creating some of the most bizarre and unique characters ever to be put to pen and illustrated onto paper, legitimizing the concepts of a rich billionaire who dresses up in the Batsuit to take on criminals as vengeance for the murder of his parents, an alien from another planet being raised by humans to become the ultimate symbol of hope, a literal god that is raised by a secluded island of women to become one of the strongest beings on the planet, and so many other heroes that most people nowadays, if you ask who they are or even their backstories, most people know them like the back of their hand. And that's a true accomplishment as a creative. To have your work be immortalized and be the backbone of so many great and iconic storylines throughout various mediums over the course of the past 80-something years. One of those mediums that DC has partaken in and kind of struggled with is their presence in the film industry. Superhero films took a while to get going on the level that they are today. Back in the 20th century, due to technology and budget restrictions, most superheroes simply weren't able to have films made about them. So because of that, the majority of the superhero media you got up until around 40 years ago, it was mostly put on the small screen. Starting out with simple black and white serials based around Batman and Captain America, to George Reeves being the first major on-screen speaking Superman, to then color TV introducing us to characters like Adam West's Batman, Linda Carter's Wonder Woman, and of course the Incredible Hulk. But the superhero genre completely changed with Superman the movie, helmed by the late great Richard Donner and screenwriter Mario Puzo, would release in the theaters in the Christmas of 1978 in the States, and absolutely made the world believe a man can fly, demolishing box office records, being praised and loved by audiences and critics, and immortalizing Christopher Reeve as the first true cinematic Superman. And a decade later, Tim Burton would also change the course of comic book films forever, releasing his darker, more gothic take on Batman, starring Mr. Mom himself, Michael Keaton, as the Cape Crusader, that would also become a monumental success. But unfortunately, both these franchises, despite still being amongst some of the most celebrated and influential comic book films of all time, even decades later, and while both their initial sequels were successful, albeit nowhere near their predecessor, both these franchises would fall massively from grace as their later sequels would diminish in quality and sensibility, and ultimately become the butt end of so many jokes. As the comic book genre as a whole wasn't doing so great beyond these two franchises. Considering the competition that was made alongside these films was shit like this.
You think I might find happiness in the animal kingdom, Ducky?
Love's strange. We could always give it a try.
And this.
Would you pull the car over, please? I think I'm going to be sick.
And we can't forget about this.
No!
and so many other examples that prove that the people in charge of making these films at the time were out of touch with what made the source material so special and universally loved in the first place. But a change in the tides would soon come at the turn of millennia, as a handful of comic book movies would enter the scene and make a stamp on the comic book genre, revitalizing comic book movies and proving once again that if done right, these movies can be massively successful. A trio of films would spark this change, that being Stephen Norrison's Blade in 1998, Bryan Singer's X-Men in 2000, and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man in 2002, all being successful both financially and critically, ultimately leading to another era of comic book films where the quality was certainly a step up, considering the advances of technology entering the 21st century, allowing the filmmakers to actually bring the concept of these superheroes to the big screen in a competent way. But similar to the 80s and 90s, the comic book films that came out afterwards mostly fell to the wayside and ended up mostly just being forgettable dreck that once again missed the mark of what made these characters so special, and didn't utilize the potential of these characters in a satisfying way. Even the core three films that kicked off this modern era of comic book films, their franchise would eventually fall in quality, and for the most part, most people were not fans of how these franchises went.
I'm the juggernaut, bitch!
But another turning of the tide would soon commence that nobody saw coming. A little film known as Iron Man would drop in the theaters in May 2008 and absolutely change the game for superhero media forever. Which is surprising considering the amount of things that this film is stacked up against. Being made under a brand new studio, based on a B2C superhero that was not popular in the cultural spectrum, even amongst comic book fans that hated him after the Civil War storyline was published only a couple years prior, being directed by a man whose biggest works up to that point was the Jumanji spin-off and the Will Ferrell Christmas comedy, being shown without a finished script, starring a washed-up movie star who had been embroiled in controversy and tabloids for nearly a decade prior, and above all else, meant to be the kickoff point to a cinematic universe, which hadn't been a thing since the Universal Monsters back in the 40s and 50s. Along with the fact that the studio didn't even have the rights to two of their most high-profile characters at the time. This should not have worked, but it did.
I am Iron Man.
And Iron Man became a big success financially as well as critically, eventually having the cinematic universe come to fruition with the culmination of this initial plan being Joss Whedon's The Avengers in 2012, and absolutely proving to audiences as well as studio heads, cinematic universes can work if done right. And as of today, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is the most profitable popular franchise globally. With 33 films, 10 TV shows, and 2 specials under its belt and many more to go, it has been an absolute juggernaut in the superhero and just cultural media space, and has been unstoppable for nearly 15 years straight at this point. But this video isn't about Marvel. Actually, where was DC during all this? Well, that's what this video is about today, folks. The treacherous, tragic tale of DC's first attempt at a cinematic universe, being one of the most fascinating tales when it comes to film media in the 21st century, filled with studio meddling, behind-the-scenes drama, power struggles, public embarrassments, social media movements, ownership changes, all stitched together by spit, duct tape, and... don't ask about that. This is the complete tragic history of the DC Extended Universe. We start off our story all the way back to 2008. The same year the audiences were blown away by the concept of a billionaire suiting up to take on crime, another film that had the concept of a billionaire suiting up to take on crime would also release, and would be celebrated at the time, and even 15 years later, as one of the best comic book films and just films in general ever to be put to the silver screen, and that film will be The Dark Knight, the second chapter of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Despite the 2000s, like I mentioned earlier, being yet another dark age for a lot of the comic book films that are being released around this time, both Batman Begins and The Dark Knight were standouts amongst the sea of mediocrity audiences were getting from other comic book films around this time. And while Christopher Nolan and David S. Goyer, who had co-written Batman Begins with Nolan and had story credit on The Dark Knight alongside Christopher and his brother Jonathan Nolan, he had his hand in the cookie jar of several comic book properties. Some good, some bad, and there's also this piece of shit.
Blade. Ready to die.
I was born ready, motherfucker.
Anyways, around this time, Goyer and Nolan had discussions while building out the initial plans for the conclusion of the Dark Knight trilogy that would end up being The Dark Knight Rises. Goyer shared his idea with Nolan for his plan to make a Superman reboot in the same vein as they made Batman in their series. Considering at the time Warner Brothers, the studio that owns all the DC characters, were struggling with what to do with Superman. After the financial and critical disappointment that was Superman Returns, coming out a couple years prior and a sequel for that film being stuck in development hell, alongside the recently cancelled Justice League Mortal, meant to be helmed by Babe Pick in the City, Happy Feet, and Mad Max Fury Road director George Miller, falling to the wayside due to WB failing to secure tax breaks to film in Australia, due to the 2007 writer's strike, preventing WB from getting a completed script ready to shoot, alongside Batman vs Superman film being stuck in development hell, trying to hop on the success of other Versus films around this time. But that film remained stagnant. for now. And as in terms of Superman standalone films, alongside Superman Returns 2 being in the works, there was also Superman Flyby, a Superman reboot that was going to be directed by Charles Angels and Terminator Salvation director McG. Comic book writer Grant Morrison also pitched a Superman reboot that would be akin to the iconic Superman storyline Superman All-Star, while another iconic comic book writer Mark Millar and director Matthew Vaughn, who would go on to make some of the best comic book films of the genre, and also Argyle, but we don't talk about that, pitched to WB of doing an epic 8-hour-long Superman story that would be broken up into a trilogy similar to Lord of the Rings, that was going to have, at least at their pitch, have Charlie Cox, whom Vaughn worked with on another loose DC adaptation in Stardust, playing Superman. That's a hell of an alternate timeline that I'd be curious to see. Amongst other pitches by comic book writers Brett Metzler, Mark Waid, and Jeff Johns. Put a pin in this guy, because he becomes very integral later to his narrative. But to sum it up shortly, WB did not know what the hell they were doing with Superman, which becomes a constant issue as you'll see throughout the story. But back to Nolan, he was so impressed by Goyer's Superman pitch, when he presented it to WB execs, they immediately hired on Goyer as a writer and Nolan as a producer, and their Superman film titled Man of Steel shot quickly up to the priority list when it came to these Superman projects. Given their proven success already with their Batman films, the film immediately started climbing up the ranks of the development stages, considering WB needed to have solid ground for a Superman film by 2011, or else they could be sued by the Siegel family estate, Jerry Siegel being the writer that created Superman for those who are unaware, who owned 50% of the rights and profits to Superman's origins, pretty much meaning the WB could be sued for loss of revenue of an unproduced Superman project, causing any other Superman projects to be shelved to prioritize Man of Steel, effectively killing all these projects. Amongst Goyer working hard on the script, Nolan and the WB execs were looking for a director to helm this project. Such names as Guillermo del Toro, Darren Aronofsky, Duncan Jones, Robert Zemeckis, Jonathan Liebsman, Matt Reeves, and Ben Affleck, ironically enough, were all considered to direct the film. But WB and Nolan would eventually settle with one Zack Snyder, one of the most integral people in the story. Zack Snyder was an up-and-coming working director at the time, who had experience in adapting people's work and bringing his own unique style to it. His directorial debut would be remaking George Romero's celebrated 1978 classic, Dawn of the Dead, to modern audiences in 2004, which was written by then up-and-coming Trauma and Scooby-Doo screenwriter James Gunn, who of course has no influence or bearing on the story. Dawn of the Dead would be well received amongst audiences and critics, and would be a financial success, and is regarded as one of the better horror remix zombie films that came out at the time. Riffing off the success of Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later a couple years prior, that really brought the zombie genre back from the ashes after being burnt out decades prior. But Snyder and Gunn still implemented their own style onto Romero's work and had fun with the material they were given. It led Snyder to his sophomore effort a couple years later, being his first comic book adaptation that would end up being the Swords and Sandals bloody extravaganza, 300. 300 to me is where Snyder shows his biggest strengths as a visual storyteller. The style is so well versed in what is going on, amongst this larger and less dramatic story. The bloody action is stylized in a way that makes it uniquely Snyder's, and the story is simplistic enough to where that can carry a film to be entertaining and well realized. And upon release, the film was well received and made bang for the studio. Snyder's work on 300 eventually gave him way to tackle a much more ambitious story, adapting the work of Alan Moore's most celebrated work as a writer to many, and being one of the most celebrated graphic novels ever since it came out 40-some years ago in Watchmen. Despite being in development hell for a handful of years until Snyder decided to pick up the mantle as director, he somehow managed to pull this extremely complex and tangled story into a feature film with the help of the writing, to make a film that, despite being far from perfect, and the limits of the runtime hindered the storytelling that made the source material so powerful in the first place. It was given good enough feedback upon its release in early 2009, with most praising the visuals, the acting, production design, and Snyder's style, that he continues to stamp onto every one of his projects thus far. And while it did receive a fair amount of criticism, and it wasn't a smash hit at the box office, WB definitely kept their eye on him. And when this Man of Steel project came around knocking on his door, given the fact that he had directed 2 comic book adaptations previously, one of which being a DC project, Snyder put enough of an impression on Nolan and the execs at WB that they officially signed him on as director in October 2010. Casting would soon follow over the next couple months, eventually settling on one Henry Cavill, being the next actor to take on the Superman mantle. After being rejected twice for the role previously with Superman Flyby, and losing out the role of Brandon Routh for Superman Returns, Cavill would finally be able to take on the role that most actors would kill for, and was announced to be the new Man of Steel in January 2011. Filming was to commence later that year in August and conclude in February 2012, with additional reshoots taking place a handful of months later. Marketing would start for the film starting December 2012, with a cryptic website that would relay some messages teasing the poster, and that the trailer of the film was imminent. Then the official marketing would unveil over the next 6 months, preparing audiences to see this new version of Superman on the big screen. Then, Man of Steel would finally arrive to general audiences across the world in June 2013, and it isn't what WB was hoping for or expecting. Upon release, the film was met with mixed reactions across the board from critics and audiences, with many criticizing the tone of the film for being too similar to Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, which by the time this film came out, that series had already wrapped, and many felt like Superman didn't need the dark and gloomy treatment that the Nolans and Goyers give to Batman. Furthermore, some people were annoyed and some were straight up angry at the choices Goyer and Snyder decided to make Superman do in this film, from allowing the destruction of Metropolis to take place, and Superman being quite reckless with not saving a whole lot of people, to snapping the villain of the film, General Zod's neck, being a huge point of contention for many, as a lot of people believe, like Batman, Superman shouldn't kill, along with a myriad of other issues the film had, and didn't sell audiences fully on this new grounded take on Superman that impressed Christopher Nolan 5 years earlier. And a lot of people did put their opinions on the film out on the internet, and it wasn't pretty. Despite a good chunk of the audience did like this film and did like Cavill's take on Superman from an acting standpoint, the film would not be a box office smash like WB is hoping for, barely breaking even on its massively reported $225 to $250 million budget, without the cost of marketing and other areas of the film accounted for. Which, compared to Marvel, which is valid in my opinion given this scenario, Man of Steel barely made half of what Iron Man 3 brought in just over a month prior. That's insane. A Superman film, based on one of the most recognizable superheroes of all time, barely made over half of what a third solo Iron Man film was making. That's not great considering this was the first installment of DC's cinematic universe. Actually, let's talk about that for a minute. During the development stages of Man of Steel, the intention of what this film was meant to be completely changed as the film was nearing shooting. Back when WB was presenting the pitch for this film by Nolan, it was meant just to be a standalone piece, meant to riff off the success of the Dark Knight movies and be a Nolan-inspired grounded Superman film. It was even considered to be in the same universe as Christian Bale's Batman, but ultimately it was decided against. Then, WB focused their efforts on trying to establish some type of bedrock for a comic book cinematic universe. As they were seeing the rising success of the MCU, and knowing the Avengers was around the corner, they wanted to jump on this trend. So they focused on another DC hero to start off their cinematic universe, that being Green Lantern. Having been in development for a handful of years, and then having a rushed and messy production process beforehand to try and get in front of cameras, Green Lantern, starring at the time meddling actor Ryan Reynolds, who was not having a lucky streak of comic book films, was forced into theaters in June 2011, and it was an absolute commercial disaster from any way you look at it. DC and WB's attempt to recreate the Iron Man formula by taking this lesser known hero and boosting them up to start his larger than life universe backfired on them in a massive way, and so because of the failures in Green Lantern, WB turned to Man of Steel as the de facto start of their DC universe, and the Green Lantern characters and world would be thrown into the abyss of development hell, and be reduced to a punching bag of a joke whenever the name would be brought up, as you'll see throughout the story. Following the mixed success of Man of Steel, WB was satisfied enough with the results that they announced Zack Snyder and David Goyer would return for a Man of Steel sequel, with Snyder later saying that the film would include Batman and have the two iconic heroes meet, which would start setting up the breadcrumbs for a larger universe after Wayne Satellite would show up in Man of Steel. This was to coincide with the announcement at San Diego Comic-Con 2013, only a month after Man of Steel released, that the follow would be something completely different. After years of a BVS film being worked on, we would finally get to see the two biggest heroes ever created sharing the silver screen together for the first time. No release date was given, but it was expected to premiere sometime in 2015. Around a month after this announcement, the Caped Crusader for this DC universe would be cast in August 2013, and that would be one Ben Affleck. Having been experienced in the comic book genre beforehand, with starring as Matt Murdock in the 2003 Daredevil film, and playing George Reeves when he was Superman in the fictionalized reenactment of the 50s in the film Hollywoodland, not to mention he was one of the directors considered for Man of Steel. As previously mentioned, Affleck would take on the cowl barely over a year since Christian Bale last played the character. This wouldn't be the last time we would see major super roles getting recast quickly, as you'll see in the story, but the internet was not happy with Affleck's casting as Batman, and it would be years before we would see Affleck as a Caped Crusader in a movie, but more on that later. As 2013 rolled into 2014, the majority of the Justice League members would be cast, as this would show signs that WB wanted to make BVS more than just a follow-up to Man of Steel, but as the major launching point for the rest of the DC universe, with actress Gal Gadot, who was at the time mostly known for playing Giselle in the Fast and Furious franchise, would be cast as Wonder Woman in December 2013, being the first live-action Wonder Woman to appear in a major motion picture after years of a solo project with her stalling in various stages. Following that would be Jason Momoa as Arthur Curry, aka Aquaman, Ezra Miller as Barry Allen, aka The Flash, and Ray Fisher as Victor Stone, aka Cyborg, all being cast around the Justice League. As BVS was given a new title in May 2014, with the subtitle Dawn of Justice, further alluding to the route this film was going in. The film starts shooting from May to December of that year, but before BVS wrapped shooting, WB is very confident in their plans for the DC universe, and so in October 2014, DC would uncover a slate that would cover the next handful of years for the franchise. Starting in 2016, we would get 2 films a year up until 2020 from this DC universe. There was BVS releasing in early 2016, followed with a Suicide Squad film later that year. 2017 would have a Wonder Woman and a Justice League film, at the time being the first part of a 2-film arc. 2018 would have a Flash and Aquaman solo film. 2019 would have a Shazam solo film alongside Justice League Part 2. And finally, we would get a solo Cyborg project and a Green Lantern project in 2020. Although it seemed odd that we would get a lot of these standalone projects after the release of the initial crossover film, with only Man of Steel the basis DC universe on at the time, there were no true warning signs that this slate would go off the rails only a couple years after the release of a few of these films, and never cared the cohesiveness that WB desperately wanted to have similar to the MCU. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. DC was beginning to ramp things up with their cinematic universe as one of their films that was announced, Suicide Squad, had just hired their writer and director in September 2014, that being David Ayer. Hot off his success of films such as End of Watch and Fury, along with having many other great films under his resume, Ayer signed onto the project and wanted to make a film that essentially was his version of The Dirty Dozen but with supervillains. Not to mention the film would get some big names attached to the cast, such as Will Smith, Pre-Slap, and Margot Robbie as the main leads of Deadshot and Harley Quinn, alongside Viola Davis as Amanda Waller, Joel Kinnaman as Rick Flag, and more names that rounded out this cast, as shooting would begin in spring 2015. Not to mention in 2015, several of the DC solo films would find the directors, as Patty Jenkins, who was previously known for helming the Oscar-winning drama Monster starring Charlize Theron, was brought on to direct the Wonder Woman solo movie, with shooting starting later that year and wrapping in early 2016. Horror movie legend James Wan, who had just made Universal over $1 billion to helm Furious 7, and its tumultuous production with the passing of Paul Walker halfway through shooting, was signed on to direct the Aquaman solo film. Not to mention later on, another horror movie director, with at the time up-and-coming director David S. Sandberg, mostly known for helming the viral short film Lights Out, and later directing his feature film adaptation, would be hired to direct a Shazam solo film in 2017. And Ben Affleck was in talks to helm his own solo Batman movie after the release of BVS and Justice League Part 1. Not to mention the DC Cinematic Universe would be officially referred to as the DC Extended Universe, or the DCEU for short, despite not being initially from WB and DC themselves. It was from a writer for Entertainment Weekly at the time, Keith. Who coined the term in an article about Batman vs Superman in July 2015, and it stuck with fans after the previous term, the DCCU, seemed too repetitive and too similar to the MCU in its abbreviation. WB would try to get the public to coin their DC universe as the worlds of DC a couple years down the line, but the name never stuck with the public, and WB eventually caved in with the DCEU moniker. From 2014 to 2016, WB was placing all their chips on the Zack Snyder and David Goyer's shoulders, to hopefully bring in the audiences en masse to see the true start of the cinematic universe in Batman vs Superman, showing off trailers at SDCC that got standing ovations from the audiences present, getting all types of tie-ins and endorsements to bank off these heroes as much as possible, including a now infamous being quoted by YouTuber Ralph the Movie Maker, was the strange endorsement Zack Snyder and WB had with the airline company Turkish Airlines, making several odd commercials for the company, reportedly taking more priority than releasing a trailer for the Super Bowl that year to advertise the film. Interesting strategy, but regardless, Batman v Superman seems like it was either going to be a surefire hit for the studio, and a banger to show the people of the world what's in store for the future of the DC universe, or it could be another disappointment in the eyes of WB and the audiences that watch it, that forever would derail this universe until its cancellation nearly a decade later. And as history shows, it clearly wasn't the former. Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice opened to the domestic masses in the March of 2016, and was panned by critics and divisive amongst general audience members upon its debut. While a lot of fans of Man of Steel were very happy with Snyder's continued direction and visual style, many were frustrated at a lot of the choices made by Snyder and company to incorporate into his DC universe. From Batman being a hero whose #1 rule is not taking a life, to now suddenly breaking people's necks left and right, Superman being a sullen, darkened figure whose whole arc is his impending turn to the dark side, pun intended. Jesse Eisenberg's bizarre take on Lex Luthor, as if he's playing Mark Zuckerberg in a very strange sci-fi sequel to The Social Network, and the biggest issue everybody had with this film besides
Save Martha! Why did you say that name? Martha!
was the absolute forced setup to build out an entire cinematic universe in one movie, versus letting the film be solely about Batman and Superman coming to blows. The film felt like WB had too many cooks in the kitchen, as the film not only tried to be a film about Batman fighting Superman, the film also had to reintroduce audiences to a new version of Bruce Wayne, since he didn't get a solo film prior to establishing him, and spoiler alert for the rest of the video, never will get a solo movie in this universe. The film also trying to be a Man of Steel sequel with people across the world reacting to the events of Man of Steel, and the repercussions of what Superman did, alongside tagging the death of Superman so shamelessly at the end of the movie to create more drama. And let's not forget the reason why this movie has the subtitle Dawn of Justice, forcing in cameos and side roles from every major Justice League member to be shown in this crossover movie, despite the film only being the second movie in their universe. This is something that Marvel learned early on not to do with their films, after seeing the responses from audiences after Marvel got a little too set up heavy with Iron Man 2, and would mostly stay away from that during the times of the Infinity Saga, until they forgot that lesson and repeated history all over again. But this video isn't about Marvel, like I said. The point is, the fact this movie did not stick the landing with audiences as a whole caused the movie to underperform expectations. Despite opening big, the film would have one of the worst second week drop-offs in box office history for a film its size, and would only make around $870 million worldwide on a reported $250 to $325 million budget. A film starring two of the biggest faces in pop culture of all time couldn't even cross $1 billion. Once again, looking at the competition, a few weeks later Captain America Civil War would release, which BVS moved its initial May 2016 release date to avoid competition from it, would easily cross over $1 billion and then some, not to mention being way more well received than BVS. Mind you, I'm not saying that objectively Marvel is better than DC. The point here is to show that DC was trying to rush to get to the same level of success and consistency as the MCU did, despite Civil War was Marvel's 13th film in their universe and BVS was DC's second. And with their big crossover film slated to come out not even 2 years later, WB and DC scrambled to get their shit together to keep audiences around before things got too late to salvage their universe, which would start domino effects of a never-ending series of bad choices by WB and DC that will ultimately lead to the destruction of their universe. Starting off with, one of the reasons why the theatrical cut of BVS was so heavily scrutinized upon its release was WB's decision to very obviously cut out scenes of the film so it could be sure to be screened more in theaters. Despite the film's written and shot to be a 3-hour film, WB decided to cut it down to 2.5 hours, making the already convoluted movie make even less sense in the editing room, with certain scenes that explain motivations in certain events being left on the cutting room floor, until it was put back in the summer 2016 Blu-ray release of the film, dubbed as the Ultimate Edition. This decision would foreshadow the future of not only Zack Snyder's career with DC, but even up to his most recent films with Rebel Moon, where Zack Snyder's initial cut isn't the real version and you as an audience member have to wait months or even years to see the true version he made for you. But more on that later. The next series of bad decisions would come with the DCEU's third installment releasing in the summer of 2016, that being Suicide Squad. To explain the roller coaster of a shit show that was the post-production process of Suicide Squad, we have to go all the way back to early 2016. David Ayer, after getting a picture-locked director's cut of Suicide Squad ready to show WB executives and test audiences months in advance to its August release date, things would quickly go from seemingly normal to absolutely sour. See, the film that David Ayer pitched, wrote, and shot was meant to be a very somber ensemble movie. Like the movies I mentioned earlier, such as The Dirty Dozen and Black Hawk Down, with having a militaristic-like tone and pacing, there was still going to be action and spectacle, but it wasn't meant to be a jovial, fun summer blockbuster. Those aren't the films that David Ayer makes. And because of the more somber version of the movie not testing well with the audiences, allegedly, alongside the trailers that are being released around this time, being praised for having a fun and jovial tone, incorporating songs like Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen and Ballroom Blitz, despite up the clips they're playing over the footage. And WB electing comic book writer Jeff Johns and John Berg, the former co-head of production over at WB, to helm the new DC branch at WB, to steer the DC ship in the right direction, to get where Marvel's at success-wise as fast as possible. So because of that, David Ayer's version of Suicide Squad would be mangled and torn to pieces from what it was intended to be. From Jeff Johns himself writing reshoots that cost upwards of $22 million, more than double than what most big budget movies spend on reshoots allegedly, where the film had a completely different third act, the tone of the film was a lot lighter, and the relationship between the Joker and Harley Quinn had a lot of the darker elements stripped out, so it could be more appealing to the teenage demographic. Not to mention David Ayer was locked out of the editing room during the final stages of post-production, with WB handling over editing duties to the company that made the trailers for Suicide Squad, so it could match the vibes of the competitors' movies such as Guardians of the Galaxy and Deadpool. And for the film doing quite well for a film mostly starring unknown characters besides the Joker and Harley Quinn, it was not fairly critically as well as audience-wise, and it didn't solidify a foundation of quality that WB was hoping for going into their crossover film the following year. But before that, there was a bright spot amongst the chaos. DC's next movie, Wonder Woman, releasing in the following summer of 2017, would be the DCEU's first smash hit overall. The film was one of the few in the DCEU's run to have little to no major behind the scenes drama. Sure, there was some compromises here, such as the messy final battle and third act, but for the most part, WB and DC were happy with the finished product of Wonder Woman, and audiences seemed to really embrace it. Being the first major female-led superhero film to be a success, after decades of failed attempts at bringing a female superhero movie to the big screen. The film was a critical and financial success for the studio, and a sequel was greenlit soon afterwards, with Patty Jenkins set to return as director. But besides the success of Wonder Woman's first solo adventure, the rest of DC's film division during this time was absolutely chaotic. Going back to what I talked about earlier with Jeff Johns and John Berg being the new heads of DC for the time and running the ship correctly in their eyes, their biggest goal was to turn Snyder's dark and grim universe into having a lighter and fluffier tone so it could be more audience friendly, aka be more like Marvel. And despite the situation with Suicide Squad being quite trepidatious, it makes what happened with Justice League look like a walk in the park by comparison. To go over the series of unfortunate events chronologically, 2 weeks after BVS's release, Justice League started rolling cameras, with Snyder and company ready to continue the tone established in Man of Steel and BVS. But Johns and Berg stepped in and slowly tried to coerce Snyder to change the film to having a lighter tone, seeing the reception of BVS as a reason to change the formula for his DC projects. Snyder obliged by these requests, but slowly the changes got more and more present throughout production, with WB themselves creating writers' rooms to workshop and change the mood behind Snyder's back as they were shooting the movie, allegedly, making Snyder feel unwanted and feeling like they rather get anybody else than him to helm Justice League. Very similar to how Tim Burton's early Batman films are too dark for general audiences, leading Tim Burton to walk away from the franchise, and then having the later films take a much more silly tone as a result to appeal to more kids that can buy the merchandise. WB really doesn't know how to learn from their mistakes. But getting back on track with Justice League, Zack Snyder would eventually step away from the director's chair in May 2017 after his daughter Autumn Snyder took her own life just a few months prior and leaving Snyder in a state to where he didn't feel like fighting with WB over every decision regarding this movie, and rather spend time healing with his family. This exit of the chair would lead WB selecting Joss Whedon out of all people, who of course is mostly known for directing the first 2 Avengers films that broke over $1 billion each, and also being a piece of shit human being allegedly, but put a pin in that for now. To helm the extensive reshoots of Justice League that were ballooning the budget of the film to around $300 million, as WB was desperately trying to make the film as generally acceptable as possible, even demanding a 2-hour runtime limit be placed on the cut of the film theatrically. And because of the numerous troubled instances behind the scenes, rushed production, too many hands in the cookie jar, and a board of executives that refused to push the film's release date so they could get their cash bonuses before the company merged with AT&T, Justice League was released in the theaters in the fall of 2017, and was an absolute disaster. The film was critically panned for feeling like a jumbled mess that had studio interference and messy reshoots smeared all over it. Audiences didn't care enough to show up considering the film made only around $600 million worldwide, on a $300 to possibly even $350 million budget, which mind you doesn't even include marketing expenses, making it the lowest grossing movie in the universe up until that point. Justice League showed that the decision to try and rush the cinematic universe was a failed experiment that lost the studio hundreds of millions of dollars, and with only 1 film out of the 5 being an all-around success, DC and WB realized they made a major mistake on their hands, and from this point onwards, DC's universe would try to be less interconnected and focus more on standalone stories, never trying to do a major crossover like this ever again. And because of all the behind the scenes drama leaked out online during the film's production, and only more would come out in the years following, this would create the movement known as the Snyder Cut movement, with DC and Snyder fans across the world demanding WB and DC to release a true version of the film that Zack Snyder had shot and intended to release before being butchered by the studio. The hashtag release the Snyder Cut would follow WB for years until they would eventually cave in years later. But we're not at that point in the story yet. So following the failure of Justice League, both Jeff Johns and John Berg were let go of their positions, and longtime producer Walter Hamada would now be in charge of leading the future of DC films. Believing in more standalone stories, he decided to try and cut ties around any reminders of the past Snyderverse movies, as fans would later coin that term, so actors such as Henry Cavill remained mostly absent from future DC projects alongside Ben Affleck, which his solo film was already pretty much fading from existence after his tumultuous time during the reshoots of Justice League, on top of his relapse of alcohol abuse, led him to wanting to hang the cowl and not to lead or direct his own Batman movie as early as February 2017, after discussing with Matt Reeves on his thoughts regarding his Batman script that he wrote, and realizing that he and Reeves had completely different visions on what they wanted to do with Batman. So Affleck left the role of Batman and this universe months in advance before having to promote Justice League, and acting like he was still committed to playing the character, and WB still including the end credit stinger Joe Manganiello's Deathstroke going after Batman, which would have been the crux of that movie, despite Affleck was already out. And although history shows that Affleck would return to his universe not once, but twice, fans like me still wonder what his Batman film could have been. But with the two biggest titans of this universe put to the wayside, the remaining projects and characters left seemed to be a big challenge to convince audiences to show up to support. But early signs showed that the DCEU didn't need Batman or Superman to be successful. As was the case in the next movie released in this universe, AQUAMAN. Releasing a little over a year after Justice League in Christmas 2018, AQUAMAN would make a splash with audiences around the world, and despite it wasn't praised as one of the best comic book movies of the genre, the film performed way better than expected, and became the only film in this universe to cross over $1 billion worldwide. The Man That Can Talk to Fish made more money than both BVS and Justice League. That's a strange outcome to say the least. A few months later, DC's next film would release in the case of SHAZAM! Being one of the few original films in DC's 2014 slate to actually come out on its release date of April 2019. The small-scale superhero film, while not breaking box office records, was given good word of mouth upon its release, and started showing signs that DC might be better off doing purely solo adventures, even though this was intended to still be a cinematic universe. The solo movie success would continue in 2019, as the non-DCEU connected film Joker, being a Scorsese-like standalone piece focused on a disturbed Arthur Fleck played by Joaquin Phoenix, turning into the iconic Batman villain set in the atmospheric and stolen 1970s setting, directed by the guy that made Road Trip, Old School, and the Hangover trilogy, that somehow managed to also break over $1 billion worldwide, and become the only R-rated film as of this recording to break $1 billion worldwide. But time will tell if that holds. But still, DC was having more success focusing on these standalone stories with these odd characters than movies about Batman and Superman, further proving to Hamada and the folks at WB that they don't need to worry about the next team-up movie like Marvel, and continue things as they were. But this streak of success in 2018 and 2019 for DC would come to a stop, as the next few years would cause trouble for not only DC and the entire comic book movie genre, but the entire film industry as a whole. But before we get into our pandemic-related chapter, there was another DC film that released weeks before everybody went into lockdown, and that was Birds of Prey in the extremely long-ass subtitle that I refuse to say out loud. Birds of Prey was the result of a long drawn-out history of Suicide Squad spin-offs that were developed as a result of the financial success of the first Suicide Squad movie, as well as the popularity of Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn. At first, David Ayer was pitched to do a straight Suicide Squad sequel, but eventually passed on the project after its experience with the post-production process of the first Suicide Squad. Then there was a Gotham City Sirens film in development that would have been a crossover of Harley Quinn, Catwoman, and Poison Ivy, akin to Charlie's Angels, or what would eventually become the Marvels by the competition, but it would be one of the many DC projects that would eventually enter development hell after being announced, and would never be heard from ever again. Then there was an additional Harley Quinn Joker movie that would have followed up the ending of Suicide Squad, alongside Jared Leto-led Joker solo movie, but as you can tell, those never happened. But Margot Robbie petitioned to get this movie made, and after some time and years as a producer under her belt, she was able to pull this film together, get Cavill on to direct, and get the subcoordinating team of John Wick to make a Harley Quinn movie not titled Harley Quinn. But Birds of Prey would make its way into theaters in February 2020 as the first R-rated movie in the DCEU, and despite getting generally solid reviews, the film didn't do super well at the box office, reportedly barely being under the breaking even point for the studio. And whether you want to blame the lack of enthusiasm for the film, or the looming pandemic that would shut down theaters weeks after this movie came out, this film didn't do well enough for this area of the DC universe to be explored again. Despite planned spin-offs were in the works, only Robbie would continue in the short-lived universe. Jumping forward to our next DC film, Wonder Woman 1984 was a planned summer blockbuster for the summer 2020 slate that should have been a surefire success for the studio. Following up the first major movie that won over audiences in this DCEU, and having proven talent in front of and behind the cameras, this film should have been a slam dunk. But instead, the ball didn't even make it into the damn court. Now, to be fair, the film was never given a fair shot getting a regular theatrical release due to the COVID-19 pandemic, causing the 2020 release slate for all movies to vanish into thin air. And after a handful of small delays from its June 2020 release date, which was already delayed from its November 2019 slot, the film would premiere in theaters and on HBO Max, WB's new streaming service that launched 7 months prior, simultaneously on Christmas Day 2020. With it being the first in the year-long stretch where WB would release every one of his movies till the end of 2021 on HBO Max as well as theaters. Something we'll delve into much more later. But Wonder Woman 84's biggest obstacle wasn't its financial results, because even if this movie got a theatrically exclusive release, it would not do well with what little was open in the theatrical marketplace at the time. But as the film was released to the public, the film was panned for how poorly the film was put together from a story standpoint. Wonder Woman being a rapist? Nah, I don't think so. The film really didn't do much for the people that woke up Christmas morning and watched it with the family, and although we'll never know how well this movie did on HBO Max, because streaming numbers are a lot behind the doors of WB, the fact that this would be the last Gal Gadot-led Wonder Woman film, I don't think is a coincidence. Now let's fast forward a few months, and discuss the return of the man that kicked off this entire universe, and how he was able to get his version of Justice League to be able to see the light of day. As previously mentioned, After Zack Snyder walked away from Justice League during filming back in 2017, Hamada and the heads of WB wanted nothing to do with his movies or versions of these characters, minus some stragglers like Wonder Woman and Aquaman. But a select group of fans were adamant that the true version of Justice League was out there and wanted it to be released to make up for that mangled 2017 cut that we got, that still has Snyder's name attached as director. This would be fueled over the next 2.5 years, as Snyder would post fake images of his version of the film that he had stored in physical film rolls inside of his house, alongside certain people like Jason Momoa saying how great his version of the cut was when Snyder showed the film in his house. And with fans bombarding WB on social media with putting hashtag releases Snyder Cut comments under anything WB was posting, even if it had nothing to do with DC or Zack Snyder, WB eventually met up with Zack Snyder to discuss the possibility of making the release of this cut a viable option. And with the upcoming release of HBO Max, WB saw it as an opportunity to get subscribers on the platform, and so the Snyder Cut of Justice League would be announced around the launch of HBO Max in May 2020, and it would be released nearly a year later in March 2021. After nearly $70 million was spent to fix up the film post-production. The film was a nice victory lap for Zack Snyder and the Snyder fanbase to get what was honestly deserved of the filmmaker, whether you like his work or not, was screwed over by a studio that was constantly second-guessing themselves and took advantage of a man's tragedy to get him out of the way to try and turn his work to be like the competition. Despite I think it caused Snyder to gain a bit of an ego after the release of this cut, and the additional reshoots teasing movies that were never going to happen, wasn't really necessary and fueled the fanbase into a false sense of hope that we could get Snyder's planned trilogy with these characters and more. Man, if only Netflix got the rights. People, that's not how character rights work. But regardless, I'm so glad this cut of the film was able to see the live day, and it is a win, no matter which way you look at it. But side note before we move on to our next segment, despite this version of the film was advertised as the definitive cut of Justice League, and that Zack Snyder was given carte blanche to do whatever he wanted, hence the 4:3 ratio, 4-hour runtime that ran so long that it was almost released as a mini-series, no Joss Whedon footage being allowed in this cut, including Henry Cavill with his pure uplift for the full runtime. But the one thing that WB made Zack Snyder change was one of the post-credit singers in the epilogue that involved Bruce Wayne talking to Martian Manhunter about other metahumans in this world. That character was originally meant to be Jon Stewart instead of Martian Manhunter, but WB made Zack Snyder change the character last minute due to an alleged preference for the Hal Jordan Green Lantern being the main lantern in the universe instead of Jon Stewart's. You know, the character that never appeared in one frame of this universe, despite being in the logo that opened most of these movies. You know, that's Hal Jordan. But it's funny to see that WB was still too afraid to incorporate Green Lantern into a project even a decade after the Ryan Reynolds movie bombed. Regardless, despite the Snyder Cut was a success for the fans who wanted to see it come to fruition, and even the fanbase being able to raise fundraisers for suicide awareness and other charities of that nature, WB did not see this project as a jumpstart to revamp Zack Snyder's plans for the DC universe. By this point, he had already secured deals with Netflix to make entire universes for his projects such as Army of the Dead and now Rebel Moon, not to mention several of these actors moving on to bigger and better projects, or just outright refused to come back to work with WB, such as the case with Ray Fisher, being very outspoken over his treatment on set during Justice League by Joss Whedon, ordering that Whedon be held accountable for the abusive treatment that he gave the cast and crew during shooting, allegedly. WB did do an internal investigation, but didn't find any wrongdoing. Fisher believed that WB was just protecting their own assets, and he would eventually sever ties with WB and DC, to the point where his planned role in the solo Flash film wasn't cut entirely, and of course the solo Cyborg film would be one of the dozens of DCEU projects to be left on the cutting room floor. All of this is to show that Zack Snyder's Justice League was meant to be a closeout chapter of DC's history before moving forward in the eyes of WB and AT&T, versus giving fans false hope of bringing back Zack Snyder as the head creator of the DCEU, with the head of Warner Media at the time, Ann Sarnoff, explicitly stating after the release of the Snyder Cut that it was a great end to Zack Snyder's trilogy of DC films, and not leaving any room for speculation of bringing him back to do more movies, or dishing out other directors' cuts of films, like David Ayer's version of Suicide Squad, that even nearly a decade later after petitioning, Ayer still has not been able to get any ground of that version seeing the light of day. For now, time will tell. Now, as the saying goes, out with the old and in with the new. Let me ask you people, do you remember that little writer that wrote Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead? Well, he ended up becoming a director in his own rights, as he would helm the next DCEU project that would release in August 2021 in the States, that being the second rendition of the Suicide Squad. The story of how we got this movie is just as interesting and convoluted as to where we got to getting the Snyder Cuts. But to tell this story, we'll have to turn back time all the way to 2018. James Gunn had become a very well-known and successful director, having made cult hits like Slither and Super, before jumping up the roster to work with Marvel, and bringing an obscure ragtag group of heroes to the big screen with 2014's Guardians of the Galaxy, along with a sequel 3 years later. At the time, James Gunn was one of the big head honchos, or big guns, teehee, over at Marvel Studios. Not only making some of the most standout characters in movies within the MCU, but was also working with the head of Marvel Studios, Kevin Feige, to build out the cosmic side of the MCU once they were done with their Infinity Saga with Avengers 4, as it was known at the time, to build out the growing Marvel universe. Hell, some predicted that James Gunn might have been Kevin Feige's successor, had he stuck around long enough. But things took a turn for the worse in summer 2018 when Mike Chernovich, a right-wing commentator, got into a heated battle with James Gunn over Twitter one day, which he's very active on, as Chernovich pulled up a bunch of naughty jokes Gunn had made several years prior that, let's just say, were not in the best tone. Because of this, word spread quickly about the tweets and made national headlines. In a panic, Disney's Hellfell Film Division's Alan Horn, being the second in command of Disney at the time, behind only the CEO of Disney himself, Bob Iger, demanded Gunn be fired from Marvel and kicked out directing duties from Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which would also spark national headlines. Luckily, due to the support from fans and the cast and crew of the previous Guardians films, Gunn was able to be reinstated to direct Guardians 3 a few months after the controversy died down. But before that happened in October 2018, DC and WB came to Gunn during a time of weakness and offered him a spot to direct a DC film, getting carte blanche to make a movie about whatever DC character or characters he wanted, even including Superman, which of course would never happen. Gunn accepted the offer given to him by DC as he wanted to make his own Suicide Squad sequel/reboot, which had been in some form of development with an ever revolving door of directors. But Gunn was solidified as director in early 2019 and shot the movie over the course of the next year, with some returning actors like Margot Robbie, Joel Kinnaman, Viola Davis, Jai Courtney for like 2 seconds. Bye-bye! But the film didn't require you to know the previous movie to understand what was going on in this film. The film will be released in the summer of 2021, but like Wonder Woman 84, the film's box office was hindered by the HBO Max day and date release, causing the film to lose a lot of money for the studio, despite being a fan favorite and well received by critics. WB was a big fan of Gunn's work on the Suicide Squad, so much so that an idea Gunn came up with during the COVID lockdown was greenlit by WB and became the first DCEU TV project in the universe, spawned from his Suicide Squad film, and that became the one and only Peacemaker. A show that was announced a year before the Suicide Squad released, Peacemaker was an odd concept. To center around one of the main antagonists of the Suicide Squad, somehow surviving his injuries and going on his own adventures, seemed like another excuse for WB just to get more subscribers out of HBO Max. But the show in its first season was a massive hit with both critics and audiences alike, who liked the bizarre tone that James Gunn implemented onto this side of the DC universe. And despite Marvel's mostly been winning in all departments from their cinematic universe in this story compared to DC, there's a big argument to be had that despite the DCEU only had one TV show made in this universe, it was easily more successful in its solid 8-episode run than any of the MCU shows we've gotten so far, with maybe the exception of Loki. But that's just my opinion. The show was so much of a hit that its second season was greenlit shortly thereafter, and despite this DCEU would come to an end not even 2 years after this first season launched in early 2022, the second season will not be cancelled because of the universe change, and is in production right now as of recording this, which we'll get a little more into detail later. Now, if you thought the never-ending train of drama would stop at the DCEU in the story, well, you're about to be in for a rude awakening. 2022 and 2023 collectively would be a massive disaster for both DC and WB alike in many different aspects. Starting off with, 2 other stars that were slated to appear in future DC projects had each gone into their own case of massive controversy. Starting off with Amber Heard, who had played the character of Mara, Arthur Curry's main love interest in both Gods of Justice League as well as Aquaman, had gotten into a heated legal battle with her ex-lover Johnny Depp, you know, just one of the biggest actors in the world, as the two were involved in a publicly laid out trial of domestic abuse between the couple that lasted months and was watched by the entire world as if it was the People vs. O.J. Simpson all over again. While not going into every glass breaking and beasting in detail involved in the trial, Amber seemed to be the aggressor in this domestic dispute, and by the end of the verdict, Depp was awarded $10 million in compensatory damages by the jury and $5 million in punitive damages, while Heard received $2 million in compensatory damages as she was found liable in all 3 counts of defamation as well as defecation that Depp and his lawyer went after. This caused the public to turn on Heard, as people demanded that she be removed from Aquaman 2, despite the movie was finished filming for the most part before the trial even began. WB would confirm that Heard would not be removed from the movie, which angered a lot of people, considering how easily WB removed Johnny Depp as Grindelwald from the Harry Potter prequel series Fantastic Beasts. But considering how that series ended up going, I don't think he missed out on anything. Regardless though, Amber Heard wouldn't be the only DC star in trouble during 2022, as one of the DCEU's main stars, Ezra Miller, will start their downfall throughout the entirety of 2022. Ezra Miller, while not being an A-list star by any means, was an actor that has slowly been climbing up the ranks of Hollywood ever since his breakout hit in movies such as After School, We Need to Talk About Kevin, and The Person Being a Wallflower, just to name a few. With the rise of becoming a major star with getting his own standalone film based on The Flash in production, alongside co-starring in the aforementioned Fantastic Beasts franchise, Ezra Miller could have been one of those generational defining stars. But then 2022 happened. To give you a quick recap of all their crimes, Ezra Miller would start off the year by making a very bizarre video threatening the KKK of North Carolina out of all things to quote unquote, as using YouTube safety terms, to unalive themselves with their own guns. But that would be nothing compared to the entire month of March, where while Miller was in Hawaii, they had the police called on them Not once, not 3 times, not 5 times, but 10 separate times.
Please just knock you out, and then you won't have to panic.
Based around various incidents where Miller argued with pedestrians, lured on sidewalks, filmed people without their consent, leading to the night of March 28th, where Miller was at a karaoke bar, and after being upset at patrons of the bar, who were singing Lady Gaga and Bradley Cooper's version of Shallow from A Star Is Born, started getting heated, screaming obscenities, and becoming violent. So much so, that Miller was taken out of the bar in handcuffs, as presented in the now infamous body cam video where you can see Miller beyond inebriated and carrying Nerf balls for some reason. Then that same night, after being bailed out of jail, a couple he was staying with filed a temporary restraining order against the actor after Miller allegedly stole the wife's passport and the husband's wallets, on top of threatening the couple, with Miller saying some words I dare not repeat. Miller would later flee the scene, and the couple would drop the charges a few weeks later. But that doesn't mean the actor left Hawaii, oh no. As in late April of that year, Miller would once again get into an incident where they threw a chair at a woman during a private get-together, hitting the woman in the head and leaving a half-inch cut on her forehead. Once again, Miller was given a slap on the wrist with a fine, with no other major punishments for their crimes. The actor would eventually leave Hawaii and make their way to Massachusetts to visit somebody they knew, before turning their attention on a neighbor and her family, as Miller started to become fascinated by the child of this family allegedly Miller had no involvement with. From showing up in a bulletproof vest and inappropriately touching the child, saying the child was a spiritual being and wanted the child to be somebody the actor could guide, started a clothing line with them, alongside showing up in a cowboy outfit to buy horses from this child. Jeez, can you get any worse than this? Luckily, the mother of this child got a temporary harassment prevention order, but Miller once again received no major consequences for this issue, and instead fled to Vermont out of all places, really going on a cross-country road trip of rampage, as Miller in the same summer will later be caught sheltering a woman who he met while in Hawaii, alongside her 3 young children in his farmhouse, aged 1 to 5 years. But reportedly, Miller's living conditions were not safe for the children, as Miller's gun collection was easily accessible to the young kids present, who had assault rifles propped up on top of the kids' stuffed pillows, and even having the 1-year-old child of these children being caught with a loose bullet in his mouth, alongside Miller and the other adults smoking copious amounts of the devil's lettuce, as you call it, around the kids, and even using one of the older kids' arms to waft the smoke into the baby's face. Again, what the fuck am I reading? And that wasn't all, folks. Miller was also caught breaking into the home of another private residence to steal alcohol, as if they couldn't afford to get any. And you know what they got for all this? 1 month of probation. And that wasn't all that came to light that summer, as the parents of an 18-year-old woman, Dakota Iron Eyes, tried to get custody of their daughter and a temporary order of protection against her from Miller, after a long and tenuous relationship between the two started all the way back to 2016 when Miller was 23 and she was 12. Jesus Christ. No, not that one. Anyways, Miller used their influence to allegedly groom the minor into making them a guardian figure for her. Miller would do drugs with her, abuse her, and leave markings for simple things like wearing makeup. Not to mention manipulating her mind to thinking her parents were the bad guys and that she was a Native American spider goddess and that he was Jesus Christ who was gonna start an indigenous revolution together. People, what am I reading? Eventually, Dakota would speak out against her parents for prosecuting Miller, as Miller themselves were making vague posts on their Instagram, saying how they were in a different universe and that they wouldn't be able to catch them. They mean the parents who wanted to ensure the child's safety. Mind you, these situations were all unfolding as Miller was doing research for The Flash that they themselves were starring in. WB got a lot of heat from the press and the general public, who saw this train wreck unfolding throughout the months of 2022 for keeping Miller on the Flash film and not even coming out to be outspoken against the actor's troubles. This could all stem from an incident Miller had back in 2020, right as the world was shutting down, where Miller was caught on camera intoxicated getting physical with the fan by getting their hand onto her neck and pulling her to the ground. Now, this incident isolated didn't really cause much waves, but many people, including me, believe that this incident kicked off these tragic series of events to unfold because Miller wasn't too deep with DC and WB to be pulled away from The Flash. The $250 million blockbuster had already been shot by this point, and WB couldn't afford to replace them in this movie. And I don't mean them as in just Miller's gender identity, I mean there's multiple versions of Miller in the damn movie. WB didn't want to add on to the bad press, but had they nipped it in the bud early with this situation, maybe Miller wouldn't have caused as big of a ruckus if they knew the consequences of their actions. Or at least had good people around them to keep them in a good state. Luckily, there hasn't been any major incident from the actor since 2022, but that also might just be because the actor has essentially been blacklisted from Hollywood. But regardless, seeing the lack of consequences being thrown at an actor who was one of the main faces of DC, unlike just having a supporting role like Amber Heard, didn't bode well for the impending release of the Flash movie. But despite WB not being Miller's guardians by any means, there is something to be said about keeping your assets in check, so they don't blow up in your face. But there might be an explanation as to why WB and DC weren't focused on discussing Ezra Miller and Amber Heard in 2022, because the company was being bought out around the same time. AT&T had enough of managing Warner Media, especially after the disastrous results of deciding to release an entire year slate worth of multi-million-dollar movies onto a streaming service, costing WB hundreds of millions of dollars, multiple major filmmakers like Christopher Nolan ditching the studio, and just having bad press all around. AT&T sold Warner Media to none other than Discovery, then try and settle all the debt Warner Media has been raking up over the years. And in April 2022, CEO of Discovery David Zaslav became the head of the now merged company, Warner Bros. Discovery. Due to this new change, David Zaslav made some major changes in the heads of WB and DC. Toby Emmerich, who had been the main chairman of Warner Bros. Since 2018, resigned from his position only a few months after the merger was finalized. Walter Hamada would also later resign from his position as the main head of DC Films, later in 2022 due to all the changes Zaslav made to his DC plans. Zaslav wanted to salvage as much of the popular brand recognition to their popular franchises as much as possible, and wanted to focus on more theatrical films versus streaming content, opposed to how Toby Emmerich ran things. So movies like a planned Wonder Twins film slated for HBO Max that was heavy into pre-production as so far as to get the main cast members for the Wonder Twins would fizzle up as Zaslav would cancel the project. But that wouldn't be the biggest DC film to be cancelled, as another HBO Max exclusive film, Batgirl, which was intended to spring off the original ending of the Flash film, where a returning Michael Keaton Batman from the Tim Burton era of Batman films, after becoming a new Batman of the DCEU to replace Ben Affleck as a Cape Crusader, was meant to train and mentor a young Barbara Gordon, played by Leslie Grace, as other cast members such as Brendan Fraser were cast in the film as the villain Firefly, and the returning J.K. Simmons would have come back to play Commissioner Gordon after having a small role in both cuts of Justice League. The film was entirely shot with a reported $90 million budget, but in the late summer of 2022, the film was announced to be completely shelved and scrapped entirely so WBT can use the film for tax purposes, becoming one of the most infamously shelved films of all time due to how widely publicized the film was from the very set photos and how the film was already in the can before being thrown away entirely. Peter Safran, one of the producers of several of these DCEU films, as well as other franchises like The Conjuring and WB's stable, stated that the film was unwatchable and would have further hurt DC's brand. This also alluded to a rumor that was spreading around this time, that WBD wanted to reboot the DCEU and start completely fresh, abandoning any projects that would tease fans for the future of a universe that WBD didn't have any faith in. But as WBD was attempting to take charge of the DC universe, one man stood in the way of it all, or at least he thought he did. People, let me introduce you to a man that you already know. John Cena wouldn't be the only former wrestler to star in a DC project in 2022, as Dwayne "The Rock" the Man Johnson would headline Black Adam, a long-awaited project that had been in various stages of development hell for well over 15 years by the time the film finally came out. Johnson was approached to play the character all the way back in 2007, when a Shazam film was in early stages of development at New Line Cinema, where Johnson was initially in talks to play the title character, but him and his fanbase ended up being more interested in playing the hero's antagonist than Black Adam. Considering around this time he had just started his acting career, mostly playing villains in movies like The Mummy Returns as the Scorpion King, or the terrible adaptation of Dune that we all like to forget, but Johnson was eager to play the character, and was officially cast in 2014 when the Shazam movie was announced alongside the 2014 DC slate that I mentioned earlier. But during a meeting with DC's head at the time, Jeff Johns, Johnson was more interested in having a standalone film based on Black Adam, rather than just being a villain in somebody else's movie. Since by 2014, Johnson was an A-list celebrity and was headlining movies left and right. And so, the decision to remove Black Adam from the Shazam movie happened early on in the film's development. Throughout the years, Johnson tried to get his Black Adam movie made, but various things caused the movie to be stagnant until 2019, when Johnson was able to get John Micheal Sarah to helm the movie after working with Johnson on Jungle Cruise. The movie was able to shoot relatively quickly after that, minus some COVID delays, and was slated for a fall 2022 release. During the press junket for the film, Johnson alluded to the fact that Black Adam was going to be the new cornerstone of the DCEU, implying that he had a multiple film arc planned for Black Adam, such as a trilogy of movies, several spin-offs such as Hawkman being pitched at WB, alongside a Black Adam vs Superman film that Johnson was dishing out over various interviews, and implying that he was able to sway WB execs into getting somebody that the fans really wanted. Not to mention another DC project that he was involved in, that being the animated movie DC League of Super Pets, where Johnson voiced the main character Crypto the Superdog. There was a post-credit scene in that film teasing a Black Adam and Superman crossover, even though it was in a different universe. Johnson was ready to take over DC, even reportedly bypassing the producers that helped him get the movie that he wanted to get made, to pitch to David Zaslav directly about his multi-year plan with Black Adam. Alongside having the balls to bring back Henry Cavill, the man has starred in the movie that kicked off this universe, to suit up as a Cape Crusader in a post-credit stinger that, if I hadn't alluded to it already, was spoiled by Johnson during interviews to hype up the film. The cameo was filmed only a month before the movie released. After Johnson went behind Walter Hamada's back and went to his bosses, that being the main WB film producers Michael DeLuca and Pamela Abdy, to secure Cavill's cameo for not only Black Adam, but have filmed a cameo for The Flash as well. The DC fans, and especially Snyder fans, were mostly ecstatic seeing Cavill back in the red and blue tights on the big screen once again. And with the confirmed return of Ben Affleck in the Flash film, as well as one point Aquaman 2, it seemed like the Snyderverse was coming back in some way, shape, or form, and that the DCEU was going to feel like a shared universe once again, where Walter Hamada reportedly laying the groundwork with The Flash to set up a Crisis on Infinite Earths story, though would be their equivalent to Marvel's Endgame level event. I would say Secret Wars, but Marvel hasn't gone there yet. But regardless, things seem to become consistent for DC once again. 2023 had a full slate of movies ready to go, along with Henry Cavill formally announcing on his Instagram that he was indeed returning to the role of Superman, and that what fans saw in Black Adam was only a small taste of what was to come, not to mention a renewed development of Man of Steel 2. And you know what happened after all that? Everything went to shit. Within a matter of weeks, things completely shifted over at WBD as Walter Hamada had officially exited DC's film division to move over to Paramount, as James Gunn, director of the Suicide Squad and showrunner of Peacemaker, was announced alongside Peter Safran to run what would become DC Studios, DC's own film division that would report to WB and Zaslav directly instead of just being a branch of WB like it had been under Hamada and Emmerich's management. Within the same week, Henry Cavill was reportedly no longer set to come back as Superman, and as planned featured with Black Adam, his Man of Steel sequel, his cameo in The Flash, and more were going to be cut entirely. And Dwayne Johnson's Black Adam cinematic universe fell completely to the wayside after his film failed to make waves to the box office, as he also exited from his role in DC. Within a single year, we had two major stars of this franchise being involved in major publicized controversies, multiple cancelled movies, several changes in leadership, and leaving the future of this franchise back to the shakeout and certain levels that it's always been at since the days of BVS and Justice League. This would lead us into 2023, where we would get the bold announcement by James Gunn himself directly via a YouTube video, announcing his own plans for his own DC cinematic universe, being referred to now as the DCU. As being described in the video, James Gunn announced part of the first chapter of his universe being labeled as Gods and Monsters, as the slate would consist of 5 movies and 5 shows, both from popular and obscure characters, to fill out the beginning stages of this universe. From animated shows, live action shows, characters like Swamp Thing and the Authority getting their own feature films, alongside the big characters like Batman and Superman, slated to get their own films. Not to mention later on, that a lot of Gunn's cast members, from his own works from the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker, would carry over into his new DCU, despite his works would technically not count as canon. Does that make sense? Probably not, but that's the reality we live in. And while Gunn's slate was ambitious and very exciting to many people, including me at the time when this video dropped, there was one major issue that looking back on it a year and a half later seemed very odd. The fact that James Gunn announced a brand new universe, while he still had 4 movies of the old universe in the can ready to be released throughout the remainder of 2023. This isn't something like Disney acquiring Fox when there were a couple X-Men films slated to come out, because it's not like the MCU was making an X-Men film 2 years after Dark Phoenix and New Mutants came out. DC still had to release these movies, because I guess they couldn't just scrap them like they did with Batgirl. So the decision to essentially tell the world that the DCEU was ending after 2023 was an odd move on both WB and James Gunn's part, because this would cast a dark shadow on 2023 for not only DC and Warner Brothers, but for superhero films in general. Apart from a couple of exceptions, such as James Gunn's aforementioned Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. The first in a long line of DCEU films arriving dead on arrival will be Shazam! Fury of the Gods, a film that had very little hype from its marketing and audience response, not to mention being stacked up against multiple other major franchise films when it was released in March of last year. Fury of the Gods did nothing to break box office records, other than how far it fell off compared to the first film, which that film didn't even do gangbusters. But with the film not even making $200 million worldwide, it showed that the decision to already announce a new DC universe would cost Warner Bros. And DC hundreds of millions of dollars. That would be more confirmed with their next release in The Flash during the summer of 2023. Now, as mentioned previously, this movie had a very rough history to get to the silver screen. From its initial development of having a revolving door of directors, clashing on what the idea of this film was going to be, to finally having director Anthony Muschietti, who made 2 of the most successful horror films of all time financially with the It duology, to then have your lead star of the film being involved in a series of crimes while the movie's ongoing reshoots, to then having various projects being announced to essentially render whatever happens in this film useless, such as announcing a Supergirl movie beforehand that allude to all but having such a Kai reprisal role from the movie, on top of cancelling Batgirl that's meant to springboard off this movie. The Flash has had a rough beating to get to its release. But for a brief window during the spring in 2023, things seemed like it could be the underdog movie of the year. From early reactions to CinemaCon that year calling it one of the best superhero films of all time months in advance, major stars like Tom Cruise and Stephen King, out of all people, praising the movie and saying it's the movie we need right now, all gearing up for a film that, despite the controversy revolving around the star, it would be a film so good that you would forget Ezra Miller's crimes. And then The Flash came out, and oh my god. The Flash, very similar to Wonder Woman 84, was a film that quickly found the ratings and audience reception. From being a phenomenal superhero film to then being an overrageable mess, with some of the worst CGI in a blockbuster when it comes to recent memory. The Flash would open at dismal numbers when it opened in the States of June of 2023, and its second weekend drop off and forward would be one of the fastest downfalls when it came to a major wide release movie in recent box office history, especially in the superhero genre, which, considering the summer that it was in, with multiple major movies failed to bring in audiences in a major way, that's saying a lot. The film did not blow away audiences in any way, and although there were fans, the few people that went to see it criticized it for its adaptation of the Flashpoint storyline, the acting, the terrible, and I mean what the fuck, visual effects, the multiverse and superhero fatigue settling in. It's so much more that not only did it blatantly remind people of Ezra Miller's crimes, but it secured a Dust Seal warrant to the feature this character getting another standalone film, very similar to Green Lantern, as the film failed to even make its inflated budget back worldwide. And despite James Gunn trying to hype up the film as much as he could, and stating that it would match with DCU, stating that it would be the reset button for the DC universe, it didn't do anything but end up on a stupid joke that meant nothing. And if it wasn't for another major superhero flop in the Marvels, it would walk away as the biggest box office flop of 2023. And after the fallout of The Flash, all hopes of the sequel were dashed, all cast members involved were recast, but at least Andy Micheal was able to secure a deal with James Gunn to direct Batman Brave and the Bold. But regardless of all the outcomes, it's safe to say that I don't think we'll be seeing Barry Allen or Ezra Miller in a movie anytime soon. And thank God, because that laugh is annoying as hell. Next up, a couple months later, we would get the release of Blue Beetle. Now, this movie is an interesting exception amongst these 4 DCEU films released in its final year, due to the fact that from its inception, the film was always able to beat the odds against all expectations. The movie was one of those DC projects solely slated for HBO Max, and whenever David Zaslav came knocking at DC's door, and cancelling several of their streaming projects left and right, Blue Beetle was not only allowed to stay around, but be upgraded to getting a theatrical release. Something Zaslav did to several HBO Max films in 2023, from Evil Dead Rise, Magic Mike 3, the House Party remake, etc. On top of the fact that James Gunn stated that Zulio Mario Wayne's Tommy Reyes was one of the few characters that would definitely be carried over to his new DC universe, and be the only returning character so far that wasn't already in James Gunn's wheelhouse, alluding to the fact that this wouldn't be just another dead end like a scene for the films around it. Especially considering watching the film has no direct mentions of any DCEU events, and really only references characters like Flash, Superman, and Batman vaguely. With all that being said though, the film didn't do much to bring in audiences to see the first live-action Hispanic-led superhero film, and whether you want to blame the lack of hype in DC or just superhero films in general, or the fact that stars of the film couldn't promote the movie due to the ongoing actor and writer strikes around this time, Blue Beetle will be another underperformer under DC's belt. Which brings us to our final installment in Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, which is somewhat of a poetic end to this DCEU. An Aquaman sequel seemed like a surefire hit for DC a few years back, after the previous Aquaman film banked over $1 billion for the studio. Getting the same cast and crew, for better or for worse, to come back seemed like a good idea. But amongst DC's major changes in direction, even during production, considering at one point Michael Keaton's Batman was scheduled to make a cameo in the film, whenever the plan was that Michael Keaton be the new Batman of the DCEU, to assemble various heroes for the next big crossover, but when plans changed, Ben Affleck was meant to replace Michael Keaton to make a cameo right before his final appearance in The Flash, or was it? I don't really know. The point is, there were 2 Batman that were set to appear in this movie, and then there were none. And despite Amber Heard remained in the film, albeit because one of her exes, that being the inventor of this PS1 looking piece of shit, Elon Musk, demanding in a letter that WB not cut her from the film, despite WB wanting a different actress that had better chemistry with Jason Momoa, not even dealing with the controversy. But alas, Elon and Amber got what they wanted, and she was left with about 10 minutes worth of screen time within the final cut, which is still 10 minutes too much, but by the end, even if Amber Heard was cut from the film, everybody knew this was the end. But at this point, we already had a Superman recast, we had a brand new Batman for an entirely different universe that people became invested in. All the plans, with a continuation of these actors in these roles, were dashed, and by this point, there was nothing left to give. Just like the Giving Tree, it's just a stump now. Watching this film in theaters was so bizarre during the Christmas season of 2023. As someone who has seen every single one of these films in theaters since Man of Steel over a decade prior, to see this movie close out this universe, or lack thereof, just being a regular Aquaman sequel, being a film so in denial that it was indeed the ending of the Aquaman character and of this universe, to have it play like a generic run-of-the-mill comic book movie was so strange to see. From seeing how this universe started from the minds of Christopher Nolan and David Goyer, wanting to take a mythic approach to Superman, alongside Zack Snyder, to becoming a blatant copy of Marvel jokes non-stop, it became the thing it despised most. A universe that spun out of control from executives trying to catch up to Marvel has the last shot from his last movie parody the final shot of the movie that kicked off the MCU. It really shows the poetic irony of the DCEU. The fact that it ended not with a bang, but with Patrick Wilson eating a goddamn cockroach. And that's all she wrote, folks. That's all she wrote.